Hey, I'm Paige, or Novice Cosplay, and in this video I'm going to walk you through how I made my entire Franziska von Karma cosplay from Ace Attorney. Please bear with me on some of the footage, I'm still figuring out how to perfect my tutorials. Links to all the materials I used will be in the description below, so with that out of the way, let's get started.
I started with 3D modeling the main brooch in Blender. This 3D model is available for free and linked below, so I won't go into too much detail because you can really just skip this step. And I don't have a 3D printer, so I commissioned Beardless Props on Instagram to print the model for me. Next we need to make a mold box. I just used cardboard and hot glue on the edges to prevent leaks. Then mix the molding silicone of your choice and pour it over the gems. MoldStar 16 Fast cures in just 30 minutes, so after that, I gently remove the mold and cut away any silicone excess. I repeated this step for the other gems, and used some purchased pre-made molds for a few too. Now for the resin. I used art resin and mixed an aqua-colored mica powder to get a nice pearlescent effect, then poured that into all of my molds. For the gold brooch, I dusted gold mica powder directly onto the mold and then poured resin into it. Now for this super satisfying demolding. Here is a test fit of the brooch and brooch frame. Since it was 3D printed, it should snap together without any issues. Then all that's left is to attach it to your costume. I recommend using either Velcro or snaps so you can remove them easily when you want to wash your costume. And that's the gems. For the earrings, you will need to cast 2 round gems and 2 teardrop gems. You'll also need 2 blank earring posts with loops. Glue the round gems onto the earring posts. Then grab a small jump ring and open it, putting it through the teardrop gem and the earring loop. Then just add an earring back and you're done. Now on to the bow tie. For the bow, I cut out 2 large rectangles in an outer fabric, as well as a stiff fabric. You could also use interfacing. Anything to help the bows perk up. I folded the rectangles in half, sewed along the edge, flipped them right side out. Then I quickly sewed them into loops at the center, and then it was time to move on to the hand sewing portion. I pinned and hand sewed in the bow folds so I could get them to go exactly where I wanted. This took a really long time. Once those were sewn, I attached both of the bows together, measured around the center of them, and then cut out a small rectangle to act as the bow center loop. I hand sewed that around my 2 bows as well. And finally, I attached a snap to the back of it for easy removal from my necktie. For the pleated part of the bow, I cut out a large trapezoid shape. After sewing 2 layers together, I measured where the pleats should go and ironed those in. To keep the pleats secure, I quickly stitched over them at the top edge. And after that, I hand sewed the pleated portion onto my bow loops. And with that, it was done. The cuffs were also shaped like trapezoids. I cut out 2 stiff fabrics to help with the structure of the cuffs. Since gems are going on these, a lot of weight will get added to them, so they'll need to be pretty stiff and sturdy. I used a layer of quilt batting and a layer of floral fabric, with my peach skin fabric sewn over those 2 layers. After that, all I did was hand sew on some small snaps to close them. Next up is the top. I used the top half of McCall's M8032 because it fits me really well. And for the puff sleeves, I drafted my own pattern, but the sleeves from the free poppy dress pattern from Mood Fabrics would work really well too. For the long sleeve portion, I recommend you copy a long sleeve pattern from a pattern you already own or from another shirt that you own, which is what I did. Now on to sewing. After I cut everything out and marked the darts, I sewed the darts closed. Then I sewed together the shoulder seams and one of the side seams on the lining and outer fabric. When sewing the side seams, just make sure you leave the opposite sides open on the lining and the outer fabric, because when you line them up together, you'll want the unsewed side to match up with the unsewn side on the lining and outer fabric. And this is where we'll attach the zipper. Next, I added my lining. So I put both sides together, wrong sides facing out, and sewed around the collar. Before moving on to any of the next steps, I understitched the collar, sewing the lining to the seam allowance. After that, I attached the zipper on the side and the back, but I only sewed it to the outer layer. This is because you'll need to hand stitch the lining onto the zippers instead, which is the next step. Once that's done, with right sides facing inwards, I attach the lining and outer fabric at the bottom edge. Then I flipped it right side out through the armholes. Once the basic shirt is done, it's time to move on to the sleeves. I cut out the puff sleeve out of my basic fabric and interfacing to give it more stiffness. Next, I gathered both the top and bottom edges of that puff sleeve, and then I attached the lining, which was in the shape of a normal sleeve cap. I also stuffed some polyfill in between those 2 layers to get additional poofiness. If you're using a stiffer fabric, unlike my peach skin, you might be able to skip that step. Then, just attach the bottom edge of the poof sleeve to the top edge of the bottom portion of the sleeve. Sew the entire sides together, and voila, your sleeves are done. Attach the sleeves to the armholes, and the shirt is pretty much done. After that, I just added a hook and eye at the zippers to make a really finished garment. To show you how I made the vest, I'm just going to walk you through the normal steps you would take to make any vest. The only thing you need to pay attention to is when you add the gold trim. So I drafted my pattern from scratch using a YouTuber's video guide, which I'll link below. You could also modify a pattern for this pretty easily. This simplicity pattern, for example, would be easy to adjust. Just add the 2 triangular points onto one side and make it longer. And once you have that ready to go, you can start sewing. First, I cut out the fabric and lining fabric and marked all of the darts with tailor's chalk and sewed those darts in. I repeat most of these steps on the lining and outer fabric. I'll also include some photos from a pattern to make the instructions more clear. Next, I sewed the back seams together and the shoulder seams. After that, don't forget to press your seams open. This was my second time making a vest, and the way you attach a lining is unique compared to tops or dresses. So first you pin the lining fabric and the fabric right sides together and sew them together around the neck edge, which you can see in this photo. Since there are additional triangular shapes that are added, you'll want to snip around those so that they will have a nice pointy point and be crisp when they're flipped right side out. Before taking the next step, we need to attach most of the gold trim. Sewing the trim on after the vest was partially put together, and this was so that the trim would lay over the seams. So, for example, let's look at an example shoulder seam right here. If I did it the first way, where I sewed the trim on before sewing the garment together, it would look like this, which is fine, but it's not what I wanted. I wanted the trim to be seamless and lay over it like this. So at this point of the costume, with the one collar edge sewn together, I decided to sew on the trim on all of the front edges, which I've marked somewhat messily in red on this diagram. Just remember to set them in far enough onto your vest, because you also need to account for the fabric that you will lose to the seam allowance. And to attach it, I just used a simple straight stitch on both sides of the trim. For the pointy parts, or for the sharp corners on the trim, I flipped the trim wrong side out and sewed a small diagonal line into them. And then finally, don't sew all of the trim on to the back side of the vest. You'll actually want to leave extra trim on both sides that isn't sewn down, which will be added on once more of the vest is put together. So that's why you see these red lines kind of falling off the vest, pointed out with this green arrow. Alright, so once that's done, it's time to go back to putting the vest together. Next, with right sides facing together, you would sew the armhole curves together. Then flip it right side out. Now, this next step might be a little hard to see what I'm doing, and the picture diagram isn't great either, but if you try it out yourself, it should make more sense as you do it. So you have to pin the side seams together, matching the types of fabric. So the lining side seam will line up with the other lining side seam, and the outer fabric will line up with the outer fabric, if that makes sense. So first, sew together the outer fabric side seams. Finish sewing the lining side seam to the lining side seam. But on one of the sides, you have to leave a 3-inch opening, which we'll need later to flip the vest right side out. And once that's done, we have to go back to attaching the gold trim. And once again, this is done in order to make the trim completely seamless. Okay, so once that's done, last step. Flip the vest wrong sides out with right sides facing together. Sew along the bottom edge of the vest. After that, locate the small hole you left in the lining side seam and flip the entire thing right side out. This step is really satisfying. And then all that's left is sewing that small hole shut with a ladder stitch so it's not visible, adding the snaps, of course, and giving it a good iron. Alright, and that's the entire costume. Now let's check out how it turned out.